In the vast hotel lobby, a dressed black woman simply walked in quietly, hoping for a brief rest before an important meeting in the presidential suite. But things didn't go as expected when the front desk clerk refused to let her check in, and worse, he called the police, accusing her of causing a disturbance. Until the woman raised her phone and spoke one sentence, "Activate Protocol 7. The entire hotel trembled. Before we dive in this story, let us know where you're watching from. We love to hear your thought. The glass doors of the Sterling Grand Hotel spun slowly at 11:17 on a Friday morning, releasing a gust of October air into the gold-trimmed lobby. Margaret Johnson stepped through alone, her navy carry-on rolling quietly behind her on polished marble that reflected chandeliers like fallen stars. She wore what she always wore when traveling, a charcoal cashmere sweater her late husband had bought her 15 years ago, dark jeans that fit comfortably after a long flight, and white sneakers broken in from 1,000 airport terminals. No designer labels, no jewelry except the simple silver watch on her left wrist. No assistant, no driver, no visible markers of the wealth she'd spent 2 decades building. Just Margaret, 47 years old, tired from a red-eye from San Francisco, looking forward to 3 quiet days in Boston before her company's board meeting. She'd been checking into hotels for 20 years. This should have been routine. It wasn't. Behind the marble reception desk stood 2 people who would in the next 90 minutes make a series of choices that would cost them everything. The first was Richard Dalton, 53, silver-haired, sharp-suited, the kind of man who wore authority like cologne. The second was Patricia Moore, 41, blonde, immaculate, her smile professional and empty as a showroom. Margaret approached the desk and set her hands lightly on the counter. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and even. "I'm checking in. Name's Johnson. Margaret Johnson." Richard looked up from his computer screen. His eyes traveled from her face down to her sneakers and back up again. Not quickly, deliberately. Like he was cataloging something that didn't fit his idea of who belonged in a place like this. Patricia glanced over, her gaze landing on Margaret's carry-on, her casual clothes, the absence of luxury. Something flickered across her face, a judgment made in half a second, dressed up as protocol. Richard didn't smile, didn't say good morning, just turned back to his keyboard and started typing. Slow, each keystroke a tiny assertion of control. Margaret waited. She'd waited before. In conference rooms where men spoke over her, in boardrooms where her ideas were credited to someone else. In 1,000 small moments where the world asked her to prove she deserved space. After a long silence, Richard spoke without looking up. "You said Johnson." "That's right," Margaret replied calmly. "Presidential suite, 3 nights. Now Richard did look up. His eyebrows lifted, not high, just enough to communicate surprise wrapped in skepticism. Patricia leaned in, peering at the screen over his shoulder, then glanced at Margaret again. This time her eyes lingered on the casual clothes, the simple bag, the lack of flash. "I'm not seeing that reservation," Richard said, his voice smooth but pointed. Margaret reached into her canvas crossbody bag and pulled out her driver's license and a black credit card. She placed both on the counter gently, without drama, without the need to prove anything she shouldn't have to prove. "It's under corporate booking," she said. "Medicorp account." Richard picked up the ID between 2 fingers, like he was handling something faintly distasteful. He studied it longer than any ID needed to be studied. Then he examined the credit card, flipping it over, checking the back, taking his time. Patricia whispered something too low for Margaret to hear, but Margaret saw the way her lips curled, not quite a smile, not quite a sneer. Something in between that made Margaret's chest tighten with a familiar feeling. Not fear, just recognition. "We'll need to verify this," Richard said, still holding the ID like it might be fake. Margaret didn't move, her pulse stayed steady, her face stayed calm. But inside, that old knot formed, the one that came from knowing this wasn't about verification. This was about assumption, about who Richard and Patricia thought belonged in a presidential suite, and who didn't. Patricia stepped forward, her professional smile clicking into place. "Ma'am, are you certain you have the right hotel? Sometimes guests confuse us with, 'I have the right hotel,'" Margaret interrupted gently, her tone still polite but firmer now. "I booked 3 nights, presidential suite, corporate account. It's all there. Patricia's smile flickered. Richard set the ID down on the counter but didn't return it. Instead he picked up the desk phone, turning slightly away as if privacy existed in a public lobby. Margaret stood still. She didn't tap her fingers, didn't check her phone, didn't sigh with impatience. She just waited, her hands resting on the counter, her eyes forward, while around her the lobby hummed with its quiet morning rhythm. But something had shifted in the space around the front desk. Subtle at first, a businessman in the lounge area glanced over. A young couple near the concierge paused mid-conversation, sensing tension in the air like a change in pressure before a storm. Richard hung up and turned back to Margaret, his expression harder now, less polite. "Ma'am," he said, his voice louder than before, meant to carry to other ears, "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside. There's a discrepancy with this reservation." Margaret's eyes didn't leave his face. "What discrepancy?" Richard hesitated for just a beat. Then he said, carefully, "The presidential suite is reserved for corporate executives." "I don't think you don't think what?" Margaret's voice was quiet, but it cut through the air like a blade through silk. Silence fell, heavy, undeniable. Patricia filled it quickly. "What Mr. Dalton means is we need additional verification of the account holder's identity. It's protocol." "I gave you my ID," Margaret said, her calm unbroken. "And my credit card. What more do you need?" Richard's jaw tightened. He didn't answer. Instead he exchanged a look with Patricia, a look that said everything without words. Then he turned back to his computer and began typing again, though Margaret could see from the angle that he wasn't actually searching for anything. He was stalling, performing the appearance of thoroughness to mask something else entirely. From behind a counter, partially hidden by a pillar, a young woman in a hotel uniform watched the exchange unfold. Her name was Emma Rodriguez, 24 years old, 6 months into her first real job out of college. She had dark hair pulled into a neat bun, and eyes that darted nervously between Richard, Patricia, and Margaret. On Emma's screen, clear as daylight, was the reservation: Johnson, Margaret, Presidential Suite, Medicorp Holdings. VIP tier. Emma bit her lip. She wanted to say something. She should say something. But Richard was her manager. Patricia was his superior. And Emma had student loans due, rent coming up, and a mother whose medical bills weren't getting any smaller. So she stayed quiet. Emma stayed quiet because speaking up felt like standing on the edge of a cliff, and she wasn't sure she had the courage to jump. Margaret saw her though, saw the way Emma's eyes flickered to the screen, then to Richard, then down. Saw the internal war playing out on the young woman's face. Margaret understood. She had been Emma once, a long time ago, before success gave her armor. Richard finally spoke again, his tone clipped and final. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to wait over there." He gestured toward a low bench near the window, the kind of seat used by tourists waiting for taxis, not by guests checking into presidential suites. Margaret didn't move toward the bench. She didn't move at all. "I'd prefer to wait here," she said quietly. "Since this is the front desk, where guests check in." Patricia's professional smile vanished. Richard's face flushed, a hint of red creeping up from his collar. "Ma'am," Patricia said, her voice sharper now, stripped of its honey coating, "if you don't cooperate, we'll have to cooperate with what?" Margaret's voice remained level, but something had shifted in her eyes, steel underneath the calm. "I've done nothing but stand here. I haven't raised my voice. Haven't caused any disruption. I simply asked to check into the room I paid for." Patricia opened her mouth, then closed it. Words formed and died on her tongue. Richard reached for the phone again. This time his voice was clear enough for Margaret to hear every word. "Security to the front desk, please." The words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Margaret didn't react. She didn't gasp or argue or defend herself. She just stood there, perfectly still, and let her mind drift backward to other moments like this one. Moments that had taught her that anger made you the problem. That emotion invalidated your point. That if you wanted to be taken seriously, you had to be twice as composed and half as loud. She thought about the first time this had happened. San Francisco, 20 years ago, age 27. She'd been invited to present her research at the National Healthcare Technology Conference, groundbreaking work on AI diagnostics that would eventually form the foundation of Medicorp. She'd worn her best suit, arrived early with her credentials prominently displayed, and walked toward the main entrance with her presentation notes in hand. A security guard had stopped her at the door, his hand on her shoulder, firm but not violent. "Badge?" he'd asked, though dozens of other attendees, mostly white men in suits, had walked past without being stopped. "I'm a presenter," she'd said, holding up her lanyard. "Dr. Margaret Johnson, keynote speaker." He'd squinted at the badge, then at her face. "This says keynote." "That's correct. You're not on my list. I submitted all my materials 3 weeks ago. My bio, my headshot, my ma'am, the interpreter check-in is around back. You can't enter through the main entrance." She'd stood there frozen, while other speakers walked past without a glance. One of them, Dr. Gerald Steinberg, had even made eye contact with her, a flicker of recognition before looking away and continuing through the door. It wasn't until her research partner, Dr. David Thompson, a white colleague, had come looking for her that the guard finally, reluctantly, let her through. New York, 12 years ago. Age 35. She'd gone to a luxury car dealership in Manhattan to buy a Range Rover, cash purchase. She'd done her research, knew exactly what she wanted, and walked in on a Saturday wearing jeans and a casual jacket. It was her day off. A salesman had approached, smiling politely. "Can I help you? I'm interested in the Range Rover autobiography. Black exterior, tan interior." His smile had thinned. "That's a beautiful vehicle. Starts at $215,000. I'm aware. We also have some excellent certified pre-owned options if you're looking for something more within budget." She'd stood there with the keys to her paid-off Tesla in her pocket and felt that familiar burn in her chest, not surprise, just exhaustion. "I'd like to test drive the autobiography," she'd said calmly. "Do you have an appointment?" "Do I need one?" He glanced toward another salesman helping a white couple in workout clothes, both younger than Margaret. "Let me check with my manager." He'd never come back. She'd bought the car at a different dealership an hour later. The salesman there, a black man named James, had shaken her hand firmly and said, "I'm sorry you had to come here to be treated with respect." Boston. Now. Age 47. Margaret came back to the present. To the lobby of the Sterling Grand. To Richard on the phone. To Patricia watching her with narrowed eyes. To Emma frozen behind the counter, knowing the truth but too afraid to speak it. And Margaret thought how many more times. She glanced around the lobby. The elderly white couple who'd checked in before her were long gone, probably unpacking in their room right now. A businessman sat reading the Wall Street Journal in an armchair. A young woman scrolled on her phone near the elevator. A family with 2 children dragged luggage toward the concierge desk. No one else had been stopped. No one else had been questioned. No one else had security called on them. Just her. The knot in Margaret's chest tightened, but she refused to let it rise to her face. She kept her expression neutral, her posture upright, her hands still. She'd learned over 2 decades that the moment you showed anger you became the problem. The moment you raised your voice you confirmed their worst assumptions. The moment you walked away you let them win. So she stood, quiet, still, waiting. Emma, behind the counter, finally found a sliver of courage. Her voice came out small and shaky, but it came out. "Mr. Dalton," she said, her eyes on her screen. "I see her name. In the system." Richard turned sharply. "What, Miss Johnson? Her reservation? It's right here. Presidential suite, 3 nights, Medicorp Holdings corporate account, VIP tier." Patricia stepped toward Emma, her voice low but cutting. "Emma, that's not your station. Step back." "But it's right here." "I said step back." Emma's hands fell from the keyboard. Her eyes met Margaret's for just a second, an apology, a plea, a flicker of solidarity wrapped in fear, and then she looked away. Margaret saw it all, saw Emma's terror, saw her silence, saw the impossible choice she was being forced to make: speak up and risk everything, or stay quiet and stay safe. Margaret understood, but understanding didn't make it hurt less. Richard hung up the phone and turned back to Margaret, his face set in stone. "Security is on the way. If you can't provide proper verification, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the premises." Margaret didn't blink. "I've already provided verification. My ID, my credit card, my reservation, which your own employee just confirmed is in your system." "That's not sufficient." Patricia interjected, her voice tight. Then what is? Margaret asked, and now there was an edge to her calm, sharp as broken glass. What exactly would be sufficient for you? No one answered, because they all knew the answer, and Margaret knew they knew. From across the lobby, the businessman with the Wall Street Journal lowered his newspaper. He was watching now, his brow furrowed. So was the young woman with the phone. So was a teenager near the coffee kiosk, phone already raised, red recording light glowing. The private moment had become public. The elevator chimed. The doors opened. And out stepped Thomas Walker, head of hotel security, 48 years old, broad-shouldered, 6'2", with close-cropped gray hair and the bearing of someone who'd spent 20 years in the military before this. He wore a black suit and an earpiece, and his face showed the kind of weariness that came from seeing too much to be easily fooled. Thomas scanned the lobby as he approached, his trained eyes moving from the desk to the scattered guests, to Margaret standing perfectly still at the counter. He'd been called down for a situation, but from where he stood, he didn't see one. Just a woman in a sweater. No shouting, no physical confrontation, no visible threat. He walked slowly, deliberately, his hands loose at his sides. He'd learned long ago that the way you entered a situation often determined how it ended. "Mr. Dalton," Thomas said, his voice low and measured. "What's going on?" Richard straightened, his hand gesturing toward Margaret like she was evidence of a crime. "This woman claims she has a reservation for the presidential suite, but we can't verify it. She's refusing to leave." Thomas looked at Margaret, really looked. Her face was calm. Her hands were still. She wasn't blocking anyone, wasn't yelling, wasn't doing anything that warranted a security call. He turned back to Richard with the slightest furrow in his brow. "You can't verify it, or you haven't verified it." Richard's jaw clenched. "We're following standard protocol." "Protocol for what, exactly?" Patricia jumped in, her voice honey smooth but tense underneath. "We have to be careful with high-value rooms, Thomas. There have been incidents." "What kind of incidents?" Thomas asked, his tone neutral but probing. Patricia hesitated. "Fraudulent bookings. People claiming to be corporate guests when they're not." Thomas glanced at the counter. "Did she provide ID?" "Yes, but credit card." "Yes, and is her name in the system?" Silence descended like fog. Emma, still standing behind the counter with her hands clasped together, looked at Thomas. She opened her mouth, closed it, then gathering every ounce of courage she possessed, opened it again. "Yes," Emma whispered. "It's there." Thomas turned fully toward Richard now, and though his expression remained neutral, something had shifted in his eyes. "So what's the problem?" Richard's face flushed deeper. "The problem is that we need to verify the account holder's identity more thoroughly before handing over keys to a $3,000 a night suite." "She gave you her ID," Thomas said, his tone still even but firmer now, like steel wrapped in velvet. "She gave you her credit card. Her name is in the system. What else do you need?" No one answered. Thomas looked at Margaret. "Ma'am, can you tell me what happened here? In your own words." Margaret met his eyes and saw something she hadn't seen in Richard or Patricia: fairness, professionalism, maybe even doubt about why he'd been called down here in the first place. "I checked in," she said, her voice calm as still water. "I provided my ID and credit card. I told them my reservation was under Medicorp corporate account, presidential suite, 3 nights. Your colleague," she gestured gently toward Emma, "confirmed my name is in the system. But Mr. Dalton and Miss Moore refused to check me in. Instead they called security." Thomas let that information settle. Then he turned back to Richard. "Is that accurate?" Richard's voice rose defensive and sharp. "We were following protocol. We can't just hand out presidential suite keys to anyone who walks in claiming to have a reservation." "She didn't walk in claiming anything," Thomas said quietly, and the quiet made it more powerful. "She walked in with a reservation. There's a difference." Patricia stepped forward, her voice tight with barely controlled frustration. "Thomas, with all due respect, this isn't your call. We handle guest services, you handle security, and right now we're asking you to escort her out." Thomas didn't move. He looked at Margaret again, at her calm face, her still hands, her patient silence. Then he looked at Richard and Patricia. Then at the growing number of guests who had stopped what they were doing to watch. He'd been in situations like this before. in Baghdad, in private security contracts across 3 continents. And he knew exactly what this was. This wasn't about verification. This was about bias dressed up as procedure. "Ma'am," Thomas said to Margaret, his voice respectful and clear, "I apologize for this confusion. If you'll wait just one moment, I'm going to sort this out." Margaret nodded once. "Thank you." Thomas turned to Richard, lowering his voice but not enough that Margaret couldn't hear. "Check her in, now." "Excuse me," I said, "check her in." Richard's face went crimson. "I don't take orders from security. You do when you're about to create a lawsuit and a PR disaster." Thomas said flatly, "She has ID, she has a credit card, she's in the system. You have 0 grounds to refuse service, and if you push this any further, you'll have a legal problem, a media problem, and a me problem. Do you understand?" Patricia opened her mouth to protest, but Thomas held up a hand. "I've been doing this job for 12 years. I know what a real threat looks like. She's not one. What she is a guest you're discriminating against, and I won't be part of it." From across the lobby a voice rang out, clear, firm, refined. "Excuse me." Everyone turned. An older white woman, perhaps 65, with silver hair cut in a sharp bob and a navy pantsuit that spoke of old money and older principles, stood up from one of the leather armchairs. She walked toward the front desk with purpose, her heels clicking against the marble like a gavel. "I've been sitting over there for 20 minutes, the woman said, her voice carrying the kind of authority that came from decades of being listened to. "I watched this woman walk in. I watched her provide identification and a credit card. I watched her stand here quietly, doing absolutely nothing wrong. And I watched you too," she pointed directly at Richard and Patricia, "treat her like a criminal." Richard sputtered. "Ma'am, this is a private." "It's not private when you're doing it in front of an entire lobby," the woman cut him off sharply. "My name is Helen Montgomery. I'm a retired federal judge, and what I just witnessed is textbook discrimination." The word landed like a bomb. Patricia's face went pale. Richard's mouth opened and closed without sound. From the other side of the lobby, another voice joined in. This one male, deep, measured, carrying the weight of professional authority. "She's absolutely right." A black man in his early 40s wearing a tailored charcoal suit and carrying a leather briefcase stepped forward. "I'm Daniel Brooks. I'm an attorney specializing in civil rights law. I've been sitting here working, but I couldn't help noticing what's transpiring. And I have to tell you, if this continues, you're exposing this hotel to significant legal liability." Margaret still hadn't moved. She didn't smile, didn't nod in triumph. She just stood there, watching as the room began to turn. Richard looked around wildly, suddenly aware that this was no longer a private interaction between staff and a difficult guest. This was witnessed. This was documented. This was public. And then came the voice that would seal everything. A young man, maybe 19 years old, wearing a college hoodie and holding an iPhone, stepped closer to the desk. He wasn't hiding the fact that he was filming. "I'm live streaming this," he said, his voice casual but pointed. "About 12,000 people are watching right now. They want to know what's happening." Patricia's eyes went wide. "You can't film in here." "Actually I can," the young man, his name was Jake Miller, said matter-of-factly. "Public space, First Amendment. My constitutional law professor would be proud." Richard slammed his hand on the counter. "Turn that camera off right now." "Make me," Jake said, not aggressively, just stating fact. The lobby was fully engaged now. Guests had abandoned their coffees, their newspapers, their phones. A family with 2 kids stood frozen near the concierge. An elderly couple whispered to each other, shaking their heads in disapproval. Thomas stepped between Richard and Jake. "Everyone needs to calm down," but it was far too late for calm. Patricia, desperate now, moved toward Margaret. "Ma'am, if you'll just come with me to the manager's office, we can resolve this privately." "No," Margaret said. The word was quiet but absolute. Patricia blinked. "I'm sorry, I said no. You made this public. You called security on me in front of everyone. You questioned my identity, my reservation, my right to be here, all in front of witnesses. So now we'll resolve it in front of witnesses." Helen, the retired judge, nodded approvingly. "Damn right." Daniel, the civil rights attorney, pulled out a business card and set it on the counter. "Miss Johnson, if you need legal representation, please call me, pro bono." Margaret glanced at the card but didn't pick it up. Not yet. Richard, cornered and panicking, made one final catastrophic decision. Fine, he said, his voice shaking with barely controlled anger. If you want to do this publicly, we will. But I'm calling the police. Thomas's head snapped toward him. Richard, don't. But Richard had already grabbed the phone. Margaret's heart pounded harder but her face remained still as stone. She'd been here before too. The weaponization of authority. The threat of police used as punishment for the crime of existing while not white. She reached into her bag and pulled out her phone. She unlocked it, scrolled through her contacts, and pressed a name: Linda Brown, executive assistant. The phone rang twice. A crisp professional voice answered. Miss Johnson. Margaret spoke clearly, loud enough for everyone in the lobby to hear. Linda, activate Protocol 7. There was a pause, then understood. Initiating now, ma'am. Margaret kept the phone to her ear. Richard was mid-sentence with the police dispatcher. Yes, we have a woman refusing to leave the premises, when Linda's voice came through on speaker, clear and authoritative enough to cut through every other sound in the lobby. Miss Johnson, Protocol 7 is now active. All hotel management systems are being logged in real time. Staff interactions over the past 90 minutes have been flagged for executive review and are being backed up to secure external servers. Richard dropped the phone. Linda continued, her tone clinical and unemotional. All front desk activity from 11:17 a.m. onward is now under formal audit. Video surveillance has been isolated and archived. Employee actions are being cross-referenced with company policy and federal anti-discrimination statutes. Patricia stared at Margaret's phone like it was a snake. What is this? Margaret looked at her with eyes that held 20 years of exhaustion and something else, something harder. This is what happens when you refuse to do your job. Linda's voice cut through again. Miss Moore, your employee ID has been flagged for unauthorized denial of service to a confirmed guest. Mr. Dalton, your system access shows deliberate bypass of verified guest information at 11:21 a.m. with repeated refusal to process check-in, despite confirmation from staff member Emma Rodriguez at 11:34 a.m. Emma gasped softly behind the counter. Her computer screen had changed. A red banner now displayed across the top. Audit mode active. System locked. Executive override in effect. I can't access anything. Emma whispered, her fingers frozen above her keyboard. Linda continued, relentless and precise. Front desk systems are now in executive compliance audit mode. No further check-ins, modifications or access changes can be made until review is complete. This is standard protocol for Medicorp-managed properties when formal discrimination complaints are filed. Helen, the retired judge, let out a low whistle. Well, I'll be damned. Daniel, the attorney, crossed his arms with a slight smile. That's impressive. Jake, still filming, whispered into his phone. Holy shit, she just took over the whole hotel system. Y'all seeing this? Richard found his voice, though it came out strangled. Who the hell are you? Margaret looked at him. Just looked. Let the question hang in the air. Let him sit with the weight of what he'd done before he understood who he'd done it to. The silence stretched. 10 seconds. 20, 30. Finally Margaret spoke. My name is Margaret Johnson, she said, her voice clear as crystal and hard as diamond. I'm the founder and CEO of Medicorp Holdings. The lobby seemed to hold its breath. Medicorp owns a 62% controlling stake in Sterling Hotel Group. Margaret continued, her eyes never leaving Richard's face. This hotel operates under a management contract with my company. Your systems run on our architecture. Your compliance department reports to our oversight board. And I, she paused, letting it land, am the person you just publicly humiliated, discriminated against, and called security on. Richard's face went from red to gray in an instant. Patricia swayed slightly, gripping the edge of the counter for support. Emma stood perfectly still, her eyes wide, her hand over her mouth. Thomas, the security guard, closed his eyes briefly and shook his head, not in surprise, but in weary recognition of a disaster he'd tried to prevent. From across the lobby, scattered applause began. Not celebratory, respectful, the kind that acknowledged something important had just happened. Helen stepped forward. Miss Johnson, I want you to know I'll provide a witness statement, written, signed, notarized, whatever you need. Daniel nodded. Same here. I documented everything from the moment I started paying attention. Times, statements, behavior. It's all on record. Jake held up his phone. This video's at 4 million views now. The whole world saw what happened here. Margaret looked around at these strangers, this retired judge, this civil rights attorney, this college kid with a camera, who'd chosen to stand up when they didn't have to. Thank you, she said softly. All of you, you didn't have to speak, but you did, and that matters more than you know. Richard tried one last time, his voice breaking. Miss Johnson, if we had known who you were, that's exactly the problem, Mr. Dalton. Margaret cut him off, her voice calm but cutting. You treated me a certain way because you didn't know who I was, and you didn't bother to find out. You made assumptions based on how I looked, what I wore, the fact that I came in alone and quiet without flash or fanfare. She paused. Would you have treated me this way if I'd been a white man in a business suit? No one answered, but everyone knew. Linda's voice came through the speaker again. Miss Johnson, should I proceed to phase 2? Margaret looked at Richard, at Patricia, at Emma who was crying silently now, at Thomas who stood at attention like a soldier awaiting orders. Yes, Margaret said. Proceed. Understood, Linda replied. Initiating immediate administrative review. Employee access for Richard Dalton and Patricia Moore will be suspended in 60 seconds. Corporate security is en route to escort them from the premises. HR has been notified and termination proceedings are being prepared. Richard's breathing went shallow. You can't just fire us on the spot. I'm not firing you on the spot, Margaret said, her voice steady as stone. I'm initiating a formal review process based on clear evidence of discrimination, but given the video documentation, she glanced at Jake, the witness testimony, she looked at Helen and Daniel, and the system logs that Linda just referenced, I don't expect that review to take very long. Patricia sank into a chair behind the counter, her face in her hands. Two people in dark suits emerged from the elevator, corporate security from Medicorp, not hotel staff. They approached with professional detachment. The woman spoke first. Mr. Dalton, Miss Moore, we're here to escort you from the building. Please surrender your access credentials. Richard looked like a man watching his life collapse in real time. Please, I have a family. I've worked here for 17 years. Margaret's expression didn't soften, but something flickered in her eyes. Not satisfaction, just exhaustion. Then 17 years should have taught you that every person who walks through those doors deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of what they look like, regardless of what they're wearing, regardless of whether they match your assumptions about who belongs here. Richard had no answer to that. Patricia stood slowly, removing her ID badge with shaking hands. I have 2 children in college. I can't lose this job. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. You should have thought about that before you decided I didn't belong here. The corporate security team gestured toward the exit. This way, please. Richard and Patricia walked toward the revolving doors like prisoners toward sentencing. The lobby watched in silence, not cheering, not celebrating, just bearing witness to consequences. As they reached the exit, Richard turned back one final time. His voice was small now, stripped of authority. You could have just told us who you were from the start. Margaret's response carried across the marble lobby, clear and unwavering. I shouldn't have had to. The doors revolved. They were gone. The lobby exhaled collectively. Conversations resumed, hushed and rapid. Guests returned to their coffee, their phones, their lives, but something fundamental had shifted in the space. A reckoning, a recognition. Helen walked over to Margaret and extended her hand. Helen Montgomery, if you need anything, testimony, documentation, anything, here's my card. Margaret shook her hand firmly. Thank you, your voice made a difference. Daniel approached next. Daniel Brooks, that offer for representation stands. First consultation's always free, but honestly I'd do this case for nothing. Margaret took his card. I appreciate that more than you know. Jake lowered his phone for the first time. Miss Johnson, I'm Jake. Wow, you stayed so calm. That took guts. Margaret looked at this young man who'd thought to document injustice when he saw it. Thank you for filming. People need to see these moments. They need to know this still happens. Video's at 6 million views now, Jake said. Comments are going crazy. People are furious on your behalf. Thomas stepped forward, his military bearing softened by genuine regret. Miss Johnson, I apologize. I should have shut this down the second I arrived. Margaret met his eyes. You did shut it down. You listened. You questioned the premise. You refused to go along with discrimination. That's exactly what you should have done. Thomas nodded, but Margaret could see he'd still carry this moment with him. Emma emerged from behind the counter, her face blotchy from crying, her hands trembling. Miss Johnson, I'm so sorry. I saw your name. I knew you were in the system. I should have said something sooner. I should have. Margaret reached out and took Emma's hands gently. You did say something. When it mattered most, you found your voice. That's not easy, especially when you're scared. But I waited so long because speaking up has costs, Margaret said gently. I understand that, but you spoke anyway, and that took courage. Emma's tears flowed harder now, but they were different tears, not shame, relief. I want to transfer, Emma said suddenly, to guest services oversight. I want to make sure this never happens to anyone else. I want to learn how to advocate for people who can't advocate for themselves. Margaret nodded slowly. Linda, she said into the phone which was still connected, make a note. Emma Rodriguez, full scholarship to our corporate training program. Guest advocacy track. Emma's eyes went wide. Miss T. Johnson, I don't know what to say. Say yes. Margaret replied simply, yes. Emma whispered, yes. Thank you. Linda's voice came through. Noted. I'll have HR reach out within 24 hours. Miss Johnson, would you like me to complete your check-in now? Margaret looked at the front desk, at the computer screen still locked in audit mode, at the space where Richard and Patricia had stood minutes ago, at Emma, who was wiping her eyes and smiling through tears. Yes. Margaret said, let's finish this. Within seconds, Emma's screen unlocked. A key card emerged from the printer. Emma picked it up with both hands like it was something sacred and extended it to Margaret. Presidential suite, Emma said, her voice steadier now. 18th floor, and Miss Johnson, thank you, for not walking away, for making them see. Margaret took the key gently. Thank you for finding your voice when it mattered. She picked up her carry-on, the same bag that had sat beside her through this entire ordeal, and began walking toward the elevator. Her steps were measured, unhurried. She wasn't fleeing, she was simply leaving on her own terms. As she reached the elevator, Helen called out, Miss Johnson. Margaret turned. You changed something today, Helen said. People witnessed what happened, and they won't forget it. Margaret nodded once. Then she stepped into the elevator, pressed 18, and watched the doors close. Alone in the mirrored box, she finally let her shoulders drop. Let out a long, slow breath. Let the weight of the past 90 minutes settle onto her like a heavy coat. She looked at herself in the elevator mirror. Same cashmere sweater, same jeans, same sneakers, same woman who'd walked in. But the world had seen her now, really seen her, not as a threat, not as someone who didn't belong, as a person who'd refused to disappear. The elevator doors opened onto a quiet hallway carpeted in deep burgundy. The presidential suite was at the end, behind double doors with brass handles that gleamed in the soft lighting. Margaret slid the keycard into the slot. Green light. Click. She pushed the doors open. The suite was exactly as advertised, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Boston cream sofas arranged around a marble fireplace, a dining table that could seat 8 fresh white orchids on the coffee table. Through an archway, a bedroom with a king bed and silk curtains. It was beautiful. Perfect, everything she'd paid for, and she felt completely empty. She set her carry-on by the door and walked to the windows. The city spread before her, the golden dome of the State House, the trees beginning to turn autumn colors, the Charles River winding through like a ribbon. She stood there for a long time, her hand pressed against the cool glass, and thought about what had just happened. About Richard's face when he realized who she was. About Patricia grabbing her bag. About Emma's tears and Thomas's regret and the strangers who'd stood up. About the fact that it had taken all of that witnesses' video, corporate power, a viral moment, just to get her a hotel room she'd already paid for. Her phone buzzed. A text from her daughter Sophia, a sophomore at MIT. Mom, I just saw a video. Are you okay? What happened? Margaret stared at the screen. She didn't want Sophia to see this. Didn't want her to know that even at 47, even as a CEO, even with all the success and security in the world, her mother could still be treated like she didn't belong. She typed, I'm fine, sweetheart. Just a misunderstanding. All handled. The response came immediately. Mom, I'm 19, not 9. I know what I saw. You don't have to protect me from reality. Margaret's eyes stung. I know, baby, old habits. Are you really okay? Margaret looked around the empty suite. The perfect furniture, the perfect view, the perfect silence. I don't know, she typed honestly. But I will be. I'm proud of you, for not backing down. I love you. Love you too. Call me later. Promise. Margaret set the phone down and walked to the bedroom. She lay down on the bed, pristine, untouched, expensive, and stared at the ceiling. She thought about all the moments like this one. All the times she'd had to prove her worth to people who'd already decided she had none. And she thought about something her late husband James had told her years ago, back when she was just starting Medicorp and facing constant skepticism. Every time they underestimate you, he'd said, you prove them wrong. Eventually they'll learn. And if they don't, at least you'll know you never made yourself smaller to fit their expectations. James had been gone for 5 years now, a heart attack at 49, sudden and devastating. But his words remained. She pulled out her phone and opened her notes app. She started typing. Today I walked into a hotel I partially own and was treated like a criminal. Not because I did anything wrong, not because I was rude or threatening, but because I didn't look like what they expected a presidential suite guest to look like. This isn't new. It's a pattern I've lived with for 20 years. The security guard who thought I was a translator. The car salesman who assumed I couldn't afford the vehicle I wanted to buy. The man at a charity gala who laughed when I said I was a CEO. I could have walked away today, gone to another hotel, avoided the confrontation, but I didn't, because walking away is what they want. It's easier for them, quieter, it doesn't force them to confront their bias. So I stayed. I stood there. I made them see me, and I'll keep doing it. Because if I don't, who will? She saved the note and closed her eyes. She was exhausted. Not physically, emotionally, the kind of exhaustion that came from having to be perfect while others were allowed to be prejudiced. Her phone rang. Not a text this time, a call from an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. Hello, Miss Johnson, this is Rachel Brennan from the Boston Globe. I apologize for bothering you, but I wanted to reach out about what happened at the Sterling Grand this morning. Margaret sat up. How did you get this number? I can't reveal my sources, but I want to be transparent about why I'm calling. Your story is being shared across social media. The video has millions of views. People are outraged, and I think the full story needs to be told, not just the viral moment, but the context, the pattern, what this means for people who don't have your resources to fight back. Margaret was quiet. Rachel continued. I know you might not want the attention, but you're already in the spotlight, whether you want to be or not. If you don't tell your story, others will tell it for you. And it might not be accurate. Margaret knew she was right. I need to think about it. Of course, take all the time you need. But Miss Johnson, for what it's worth, I'm sorry this happened to you, and I'm grateful you didn't back down. After they hung up, Margaret stared at her phone. The video had millions of views. Her private moment of humiliation was now public property. She opened Twitter, something she rarely did, and searched her name. #Margaret Johnson was trending. So was #Sterling Hotel. So was #standing, while Asian. She clicked and started reading at Helen Montgomery. I witnessed this firsthand. This woman provided every credential they asked for and was still treated like an intruder. This is what systemic bias looks like. #Margaret Johnson at Daniel Brooks X. As an attorney who was present, I can confirm this was discrimination. Pure and simple, she remained calm while being publicly humiliated. That's strength. #Sterling Hotel at Jake Miller. That video is at 8 million views now. People need to understand. This happens every day to people who don't have corporate power to fight back. #Margaret Johnson. There were thousands more. Some supportive, some skeptical. CO. Maybe there was a real problem with the reservation. Some hostile. Jews, stop playing the race card. But the conversation was happening. The world was watching. Margaret closed the app and sat in the quiet of the too big suite. She thought about Emma, who'd found her voice. About Thomas, who'd refused to be complicit. About Helen and Daniel and Jake, who'd chosen to witness and speak. About all the people who'd been in her position but didn't have backup arriving. She opened her email and started typing to James Riordan, Regional Director, Sterling Hotel Group, subject formal complaint and required actions. Mr. Riordan, this morning I was subjected to discriminatory treatment at the Sterling Grand Hotel in Boston. As the CEO of Medicorp Holdings, which owns a controlling stake in your hotel group, I am deeply troubled not just by what happened to me but by what my investigation has revealed. This was not an isolated incident. My team has uncovered multiple similar complaints involving guests of color over the past 18 months. All were dismissed, minimized, or quietly settled. This represents a systemic failure of culture, training, and accountability. I will not be pursuing personal legal action at this time. However, I am requiring the following: 1. Immediate third-party audit of all Sterling Hotel Group properties for patterns of discriminatory behavior conducted by an independent civil rights organization. 2. Mandatory in-person implicit bias training for all staff, developed and delivered by experts in anti-discrimination work. Completion will be required for continued employment. 3. Creation of an independent guest advocacy office with direct reporting to the board, not regional management. This office will handle discrimination complaints and have authority to implement immediate corrective action. 4. Personal outreach and meaningful financial compensation to every guest who has filed a discrimination complaint. Not vouchers, not discounts. Real accountability. 5. Public acknowledgement of what occurred, what was found, and what will change. Transparency matters. If these conditions are not met within 90 days, I will divest Medicorp's stake in Sterling Hotel Group and make our reasons public. This isn't about revenge. It's about making sure what happened to me doesn't keep happening to others. Margaret Johnson, CEO, Medicorp Holdings. She read it twice, then hit send before she could second-guess herself. Then she stood, walked to the minibar, and poured herself a glass of water. She took it back to the window and looked out at the city again. This time she felt something shift. Not satisfaction, not triumph, just resolve. She would not let this moment be wasted. She would use her platform, her power, her voice, because staying silent protected the wrong people, and she was done protecting anyone but the truth. 3 days later, Margaret sat in a conference room at Medicorp's Boston office with Linda, her executive assistant, and 2 others, Emma Rodriguez, nervous but determined in a borrowed blazer, and Rachel Brennan from the Boston Globe recording device on the table between them. "Thank you for agreeing to this," Rachel said, looking at both women. "I know it's not easy to revisit." Margaret nodded. Emma took a shaky breath. Rachel started with Margaret. "Walk me through what happened, from the beginning." So Margaret did. She told the story calmly, factually, without dramatization. The arrival, the questioning, the refusal, the security call, the moment everything changed. "What I want people to understand," Margaret said, "is that this wasn't about me being difficult or unclear. I did everything right. I was polite. I provided documentation. I stayed calm. And I was still treated like I didn't belong. That's what bias looks like. It's not always slurs or violence. Sometimes it's just doubt, the assumption that you must be in the wrong place." Rachel turned to Emma. "You work for the hotel. Why did you decide to speak up?" Emma's voice trembled but held. "Because I'd seen it happen before, and I'd stayed quiet before. And every time I stayed quiet I felt sick, like I was part of the problem." She looked at Margaret. Watching Miss Johnson stand there so calm while being treated so badly, it made me realize that silence is a choice, and I was choosing wrong. "What's happened since?" Rachel asked. Emma smiled slightly. "I've been accepted into Medicorp's corporate training program, guest advocacy. I start next month. And I've already been contacted by 3 other people who experience similar treatment at Sterling hotels. I'm helping them file formal complaints." Margaret added, "Sterling Hotel Group has agreed to all our conditions. The audit starts next week. Training begins in 30 days. The guest advocacy office will be operational within 60, and they've reached out to 17 former guests to make amends. Some would say you used your power to get revenge," Rachel said carefully. Margaret met her eyes. "I used my power to demand accountability. There's a difference. Revenge would have been destroying careers for personal satisfaction. Accountability is creating systems so this doesn't happen to the next person who walks through those doors." The interview continued for another hour. By the time it ended, Margaret felt drained but lighter somehow. As Rachel packed up, she said, "This will run Sunday, front page. I think it's going to matter." "I hope so," Margaret said. After Rachel left, Emma lingered. "Miss Johnson, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "How do you do it? Stay so calm when people are treating you like you don't matter." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've had 20 years to practice, and I learned that anger without strategy is just noise. But that doesn't mean I'm not angry. I'm furious, I'm exhausted, I'm tired of having to prove my humanity to people who should just see it." She paused. "But I also learned that how you respond determines what happens next. If I'd yelled, I would have been the problem. If I'd walked away, nothing would have changed. So I stayed, and I waited, and I let them reveal who they were." Emma nodded slowly. "I want to learn how to do that." "You already are," Margaret said. "You spoke up when it was hard. That's where it starts." The article ran that Sunday. It was powerful, thorough, and damning. It included statements from Helen, Daniel, Thomas, and Jake. It detailed the pattern of discrimination at Sterling hotels. It praised Margaret's response and called for industry-wide change. Within a week, 3 other hotel chains announced new anti-discrimination initiatives. Within a month, legislation was introduced in Massachusetts requiring hospitality bias training. The video reached 20 million views, and Margaret Johnson became an unintentional symbol of something larger, the quiet resistance of refusing to disappear. 6 months later, Margaret stood in the lobby of the Sterling Grand Hotel again. But this time she wasn't checking in. She was here for the opening of the hotel's new guest advocacy office. The space was visible from the main lobby, glass walls, comfortable seating, and a sign that read, "Every guest matters. Every voice counts. If you experience discrimination, we're here to help." Inside, Emma Rodriguez sat at a desk, now the lead advocate, talking with a young black man who'd had concerns about his recent stay. She listened carefully, took notes, and treated him with the dignity he deserved. Margaret watched through the glass, feeling something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Thomas Walker, now director of security training, stood beside her. "We've trained over 2,000 staff members in the past 6 months, he said. "Incident reports of discrimination have dropped by 40%, not because it's happening less, though I think it is, but because staff are intervening earlier." "That's good work, Thomas," Margaret said. "It's overdue work," he replied. "I just wish it hadn't taken what it took." "Me too," Margaret said quietly. Helen Montgomery arrived carrying a folder. "Margaret, good to see you. I wanted to give you this." She handed over the folder. "Results from the first quarter of training. The feedback has been remarkable. People are actually engaging with the material, not just checking boxes." Daniel Brooks joined them, shaking Margaret's hand warmly. "I've had 4 new clients in the past month, all discrimination cases in hospitality, but now they're being taken seriously. Hotels are settling quickly and making real changes." "You started something." Jake Miller was there too, now interning with a civil rights media organization. "Miss Johnson, I wanted you to know that video got picked up by 3 documentaries about racial bias. Your story is being taught in college classrooms now." Margaret felt overwhelmed by it all. "I didn't do this for recognition," she said. "I just wanted to make sure it meant something." "It does," Helen said firmly. "You turned a moment of injustice into a movement for change. That's not nothing." The event began. Margaret gave brief remarks about the importance of accountability and dignity. Emma spoke about finding her voice. Thomas talked about bystander intervention. Daniel discussed legal frameworks. And through it all, Margaret kept thinking about that morning 6 months ago, standing at a desk, being doubted, being questioned, being treated as less than. She thought about how close she'd come to just walking away. How much easier it would have been to go to another hotel, avoid the confrontation, protect herself from the exhaustion of fighting. But she hadn't walked away. And because she hadn't, Emma had found her courage. Thomas had found his conscience. Helen had found her purpose. Systems had changed. Policies had been rewritten. People were being trained to see their bias and counter it. One moment, one decision to stand still when the world wanted her to move. And the ripples kept spreading. That evening Margaret had dinner with her daughter Sophia, who'd taken the train up from MIT. "Mom," Sophia said over pasta and wine, "I need to tell you something. I changed my major." Margaret's eyebrows rose. "From computer science? I thought you loved it." "I do, but I love something else more." Sophia took a breath. I'm double majoring now, computer science and civil rights law, because watching what you went through, watching how you handled it, watching what came after it showed me what I want to do with my life. I want to build systems that catch discrimination before it happens, AI tools for bias detection, legal frameworks powered by technology. I want to use what I'm good at to fight what's wrong. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Sophia, you showed me what courage looks like, Mom. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that stands still while the world tries to push you down. And I want to be like that. Margaret reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. You already are. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment. Then Sophia said, do you ever regret it? Not just walking away. Margaret thought about the question honestly. Sometimes, when I'm tired, when I read the hateful comments, when I think about how much easier it would have been to just let it go. She paused. But then I think about Emma, and Thomas, and all the other people who've reached out to say that seeing what happened gave them courage to speak up in their own situations. And I know I made the right choice. Good, Sophia said, squeezing her mother's hand. Because you did. Late that night, back in her hotel room, a different hotel, one that had welcomed her warmly from the moment she walked in, Margaret sat by the window looking out at the Boston skyline. Her phone buzzed with a text from Linda. Washington Post wants an interview. Time magazine wants you for a piece on women transforming corporate culture. And 3 universities want you for commencement speeches. Margaret smiled slightly. A year ago she would have said no to all of it. She'd built her career on competence, not celebrity, on results, not recognition. But now she understood that visibility had value, that her story, painful as it was, could light the way for others. She typed back, send me the details. Let's see what makes sense. Then she opened her notes app and found the entry she'd written 6 months ago, in this same city, in a different hotel room, feeling lost and exhausted and alone. She read it again. I'll keep doing it, because if I don't, who will? Now she added, 6 months later I did keep doing it. And I wasn't alone. Turns out there were people everywhere waiting for someone to stand up first, waiting for permission to use their voices, waiting to know that speaking truth wouldn't destroy them. I'm still tired, still angry at a world that makes us fight for basic dignity, still sad that it took corporate power and viral video to get me basic respect. But I'm also hopeful, because change is happening, slowly, imperfectly, but really, and every time someone tells me my story gave them courage, I remember this is why I didn't walk away. Not for me, for everyone who comes after, for my daughter who shouldn't have to fight these battles, for Emma, who found her voice, for every person who's been told they don't belong in spaces they've earned the right to occupy. I stood still, the world shifted, and I'd do it again. She saved the note and closed her phone. Outside, the city lights twinkled like promises. Inside, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace, not because the fight was over, it never would be, but because she'd fought it with dignity, with strategy, with the quiet strength of refusing to disappear. She thought about James, gone 5 years now, about what he'd say if he could see her now. She thought he'd be proud. Not because she'd won some battle, but because she'd stayed true to herself through all of it. Margaret stood, walked to her bed and lay down. Tomorrow she had meetings, interviews, work, the ordinary business of living a life that was suddenly unexpectedly more public than she'd ever wanted. But tonight she would rest, not because she'd earned it through suffering, but because she'd earned it through courage. The courage to stand still while the world tried to move her, the courage to speak truth to power, the courage to be herself unapologetically in spaces that didn't expect her. And as she drifted off to sleep, her last thought was simple. I belong everywhere I choose to be, and I don't need anyone's permission to exist.
Join us to share meaningful stories by hitting the like and subscribe buttons. Don't forget to turn on the notification bell to start your day with profound lessons and heartfelt empathy.